Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And this past Thursday, I went out to see Send Help, a survival film black comedy starring Rachel McAdams as Linda Little, a high-functioning neurodivergent corporate strategist who ends up marooned on a remote island in the Pacific along with her new boss, an Ivy League cultivated, unfeeling, chauvinistic fraternity brat named, appropriately, Brad Preston, played by Dylan O'Brien. He also happens to be the son of Linda's late former employer, the one who promised her an executive promotion for her 7-year commitment to the company, only for Brad to dust the meek and admittedly rather socially intolerable Linda aside in favor of one of his cookie-cutter golf buddies. Well, turns out that the loner Linda is actually something of a survival obsessive, so when Brad and she are the only survivors left from a private plane crash, this little worker bee turns disaster into opportunity, demonstrating incredible Robinson Crusoe-esque talent in securing shelter, food. She's even able to get some makeshift sun balm together, all while the critically injured and thus dependent Brad must weather the harsh adjustment to a new reality where he sits at the bottom of the totem pole. Send Help is an original screenplay by writers Mark Swift and Damian Shannon, whose most notable credits include Freddy vs. Jason, that's not too bad, and then the Platinum Dunes Friday the 13th reboot from all the way back in 2009, and then Baywatch, when they just decided to straight rip off 21 Jump Street with a different show and thought we all wouldn't notice. Anyway, Send Help, if I can say anything, is a much higher caliber of thriller writing than you might expect from these writers, and as a rather unapologetic film snob, I am wont to note the definite narrative and thematic parallels between this original screenplay and the 1974 Italian satirical comedy Swept Away, written and directed by Lena Wertmüller, albeit with the gender and class dynamics somewhat inverted. But with not too non-overt references to Blue Lagoon, as well as William Golding's Lord of the Flies, of course, I think it's safe to say that these texts are really more of a precedent backdrop, or a sandbox, if you will, of patterns, formulas, and cliches that abound in literature and visual media depicting people marooned on deserted islands, and either, as at least seems to be the rising action for McAdams' character, rise to the occasion. We get to escape into the actualization of man or woman, not simply withering on the vine without the luxuries of modernity, but really thriving in a new way, or of course the opposite, the descent into tribalistic anarchy and madness, as the characters are forced to confront that the hierarchies of modernity might not be so much a corruption of, but a logical projection of the inherent animal cynicism of man or woman. Some of you might be surprised I've managed to go this long without underlining the director of this mid-budget horror-adjacent B-flick being unceremoniously dumped out the back of the now Disney-owned 20th Century Studios at the end of a bitter cold January, for that director is not some fresh-faced newcomer. Send Help is not even a sophomore effort, but it is in fact the first time that fantasy and genre film great Sam Raimi has returned to directing an original film production since 2009. That, of course, having been another horror black comedy, the phenomenal Drag Me to Hell. I would never condescend to a filmmaker with a legacy as long and significant as Raimi by saying that he's sort of been marooned himself for quite some time. I know he hasn't only been helming Disney blockbuster slop. I also wouldn't discount his legacy in that period as a producer of other films, elevating younger filmmakers and not just pulling up the ladder with him. But there's still something so special about getting to see Raimi finally seeming to being able to cash some chips in, because anybody who is familiar with Raimi's distinctive style, one that he managed to hone quite early when he was just starting out in the 80s, really breaking through in projects like Crime Wave and Evil Dead 2, before he was able to carry that over into increasingly mainstream fields, so that whether you were an extreme horror junkie or just someone who was excited to see the live-action Spider-Man back when they just figured out the technology to make that character work on screen, you'll very very much see on the screen not only Raimi demonstrating a continuing mastery of his techniques for throwing together slapstick or gross out humor into a blender with graphic fantasy spectacle that, when he doesn't have to tailor his instincts for a general audience as with his comic book movies, really feels like nothing short of a classic EC Comics horror story brought to life. But Send Help proves to be such a perfect springboard for Raimi, not only because it gives him ample opportunities for executing all those things he traditionally loves in a movie, but also in that it has that habit of showing a master technician coming along after nearly a 17-year hiatus from this field of more adult-oriented pulp cinema. He gets to basically show up even the litany of antecedents he's inspired over an even longer period. The joy of seeing a master at work really is in that kind of throwing a little water on so many of the high concept, bloody black comedy or satirical action or fantasy or genre films that absolutely would not exist without Raimi, but which just don't have that much going for them other than their own imitation. Look, Send Help really is a great spiritual follow-up to Drag Me to Hell, because it gets to such a deep, dark heart of what makes Raimi's method of visualizing and directing these kinds of stories so seemingly inimitable. It's not just that quixotic combination of slapstick humor with a gallows concept. It isn't even necessarily a fondness for trashy tastes. It's that Raimi can manage to find a way to get you to enjoy yourself, even in this story that just evinces this incredible sense of misanthropy as you slowly start to realize that no matter how bad Brad is presented, and this really is comic book stuff. In fact, there's an element to Swift and Shannon's script where it seems like they throw off these breadcrumbs of possibility that you'll start to see this character in a more nuanced, sympathetic light, only for them to go basically, nah, just kidding, trust us, this guy really is just a cardboard cutout corporate villain. If he had a mustache, he'd be twirling it. You have that almost deliberately two-dimensional and almost anti-nuanced approach to this high-concept story where Linda is the oppressed outsider and Brad is that bag finally getting his cosmic comeuppance, only for Raimi to linger just enough on McAdams' performance of Linda being so utterly clueless, even sometimes give us a POV from Brad emphasizing something gross or off-putting about her, like a piece of tuna salad still on the corner of her mouth as she meets him for the first time. What it is about Raimi's direction is that no matter how bad Brad is, he still refuses to let us let ourselves off the hook for imagining that most people can truly, fully identify with Linda. Because she is gross. She's really socially tone deaf, and acknowledging that that's probably not her fault doesn't make it any easier to realize that no matter how happy, even joyful we are to see her suddenly have so much power and contentment with her new life on the island away from the judging eyes of the modern world, we're left with the sting that we would probably dust her aside just as quickly as Brad and everybody else already did. Raimi doesn't just make movies that have a gallows sense of humor. He isn't just an expert in baseline schadenfreude. It's that the worlds he brings to life are so frequently and, if anything, increasingly misanthropic. Whether it's Ash's passion over the course of the Evil Dead trilogy, or Drag Me to Hell, or now Send Help, Raimi almost never, outside of the 3 Spider-Man films, renders a world that reinforces a clear binary between good and evil, a clear narrative program to make us feel better about ourselves. His films invite us to instead truly and fully give in to those darkest, most base inclinations, realizing these stories in which it seems that finding true sympathy with any one person is impossible because they're either just obnoxious jerks like Brad or stupid, gross geeks like Linda. Raimi isn't satisfied with just getting us to enjoy Brad's punishment. He also wants us to give in to our own queer mixture of sympathy for, but also aversion to Linda, to not only accept, but embrace our own petty prejudices, to embrace a kind of self-aware misanthropy that, it turns out, is a lot more refreshingly consistent with a tradition of horror, no matter how funny it is, as a kind of romantic moral parable, rather than us versus them, rich versus poor, slob versus snob foils that give us a permission structure to put all those buried sick tendencies into a convenient scapegoat or other. And in that context, it must be said, Rachel McAdams, for me, already coming off a career-high supporting performance as the mother in Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, McAdams absolutely brings down the house, swinging for the fences with this role, and anybody who would think that the certain screen presence somebody like Bruce Campbell just naturally exudes could be the only perfect marriage with Raimi's own misanthropic love of putting absolute losers through their paces for our tickled amusement. McAdams maybe even goes toe-to-toe with Campbell as far as black comic turns in a bloody B flick, even right down to the perfect moment where she just has to mug like an imbecile, some desperate or exaggerated gaping look. These aren't just face cards. It's getting to see an actor really thrive to a degree that even in her long career of comedies in her own right, she's never really been pushed to. I think Send Help is an excellent, fun, morbid romp all on its own, so it's an easy recommendation for me. And yet, I can't find myself letting it go quite as early as that because... Okay, remember what I was saying about how this film seems to take some thematic cues from, in particular, Swept Away, that 1974 satirical comedy about a vulgar working-class stiff who gets marooned on a deserted island with some trophy wife bitch and proceeds to basically just malignantly torture and groom her until she's utterly physically and emotionally dependent on him. Yes, Swept Away is a very problematic movie. Don't go into Swept Away thinking that you are, like, watching Lena Wertmüller's literal opinion on dynamics between men and women and what real love can look like. It's not a movie about love, it's a satire of class dynamics. I think there's something more to be said about the idea of Raimi being drawn to this script by Swift and Shannon in particular, and what he seems so perfectly situated to bring a similar sort of class dynamic satirical survival film to life, as opposed to so many of the scripts that are surely floating around in an era where the paranoiac thriller about the have-nots being the ritual victims of some shadowy ultra-elites has practically been the most overt cycle in popular American horror since the first Trump administration, for thus perhaps not too unobvious historically contingent reasons, why certain ideas seem to percolate the most or the loudest in the popular imaginary. Because it is telling that in its misanthropy, Raimi actually manages to subvert the prevalent cliches of precisely that cycle of storytelling in fantasy, satirizing this era that we're in from a perspective that is, I guess it must be said, quite reactionary, but nonetheless still quite shocking, to be laid so bare in a way that never feels terribly overt, until you reach the honestly really fantastic, even spiritually brutal twist ending of Send Help. And you remember that for years it's been well known in the film industry that, along with Bruce Campbell, Raimi is a dyed-in-red Hollywood conservative. He himself doesn't make terribly overtly political films. If he makes a film that has a political backdrop, like Spider-Man as a kind of anthemic post-9/11 tribute film to New York, it's mostly by accident of timing. And moreover, there's no doubt that the particularly violent and often otherwise gross or vulgar sorts of low to mid-budget genre films that Raimi both directs and produces could be interpreted as so obviously transgressive of good middle American taste that such a person couldn't possibly get along with any kind of conservative movement. But the reality is that whether it's superhero movies or horror and fantasy flicks with EC comic book style styled storylines and affected visuals, Raimi's misanthropy has always been mixed with kernels of the sorts of romantic moral parables that define the golden ages of both those genres of visual media. And Send Help sees Raimi again seemingly as just a kind of complacent accident of timing, making his first, honestly, rather overtly political film, just as overt as the literal class war satire Swept Away. The fact that Swift and Shannon's scripts adopt the tropes of a class war horror story, but then progressively subvert them throughout the escalating, violent, and absurd battle of wills between Linda and Brad, points the way for Raimi to actually make a film that, for however much it is an obvious reaction against that kind of vaguely anti-establishment paranoiac foil in other horror flicks, still packs quite a philosophical punch in the same way that I would say any other reactionary filmmaker that is more likely to be mentioned in the canon of reactionary filmmakers that a lot of media personalities of the online left expend a lot of energy emphasizing that you can enjoy as art while being oppositional to its politics or philosophy. You absolutely can do that, but why on earth would any of us be talking about a fucking doddering old mule like Clint Eastwood or some edgelord like S. Craig Zoller when we could interrogate Raimi's oeuvre in the same way, and it's rather fascinating apotheosis with this film, Send Help, as exemplary of a kind of reactionary popular art. It's Send Help where you see a really invigorating metatextual dynamic between Raimi playing to the cheap seats of a political moment, where the pump is primed, however justifiably, for the audience to see a story like this as fundamentally about the redemption of a downtrodden character over her merciless and selfish oppressor. And then progressively, through all the gratuitous gore and bile and mirth, still a kind of merciless disdain for the idea that we as an audience should find it easier for us to imagine being justified in that situation, as Linda has a right to imagine that she really is entitled to anything she desires. That this middle managerial class autist who works herself to death and then blames the world for her own bench-climbing ambitions not being fulfilled. The earnest joy and sympathy that Raimi does show towards Linda as an outsider is not outweighed by the fact that her empowerment as a figure, far from Lord of the Flies or Swept Away, comes from this obvious fantasy of self-actualization that could practically have been written for Ted Kaczynski as a target audience if Ted Kaczynski weren't already such an incel. There's even an extent to which there might be a non-literal rhyming framework implied by the title, because while the story is called Send Help, it's notable that in addition to being a survivalism expert, Linda also inevitably turns to self-help to cope with her utter lack of validation outside of herself. I think one of the most crucial scenes in the movie is after Linda is fully reckoning with the fact that all of her hard work has seemed to be for nothing, that she's about to be passed on and left to wither on the company vine, and she holds herself and breathes and cries and tries to tell herself that she is good enough and valid just the way she is. But it's only when Linda is finally alone on the beach, Brad is still in some kind of traumatic coma, and you see the utter brilliance of McAdams' performance, and it's a blessing that Raimi doesn't seem to have cut any comparable moments where he expects so much of the story to be told only in some realization Linda has in a quiet of her own thoughts, without dialogue or narration. Linda is just sitting there on this beach realizing how amazingly she's done, how she survived, how she built this shelter, how she fed herself, how she saved Brad, and maybe how she's finally in a world where she can prove to herself every day that she doesn't need anybody. And she's finally in a world where nobody will ever judge her, and she won't have the power to fight back without restraint. But that's the kind of dark misanthropic irony that I personally think is a really disturbing feature of Send Help as Raimi's first overtly political horror film, which is that Linda, if anything, kind of also proves to herself that all of that self-help jargon was bullcrap, because no, that's not how we work. That's not how people work. We're not satisfied with just being ourselves, because while constantly seeking external validation is bad, you, just like the audience looking at Linda with this strange mixture of sympathy and utter social aversion, this implicit knee-jerk to other her, you judge yourself instinctually. You want to be more than what you are, and you want to be a version of yourself that you see growing and working for something, and those things being rewarded. Sure, part of this is just my own hobby horse as someone who's definitely doing his best to live better through chemistry and see a therapist twice a month at minimum, but is still rather suspicious and critical of the increased prevalence of self-help content in an era where it couldn't be more obvious that we need to be told to unite and help each other. We do not only relate to ourselves as ourselves, we are our own first audience, and Raimi, as a commercial director, knows better than anybody else we don't want characters to be enough just for who they are. We want to see them thrive and achieve, and that spectatorship reflects back onto our own conceptions of ourselves. In true reactionary fashion, Send Help is basically a movie all about how the superficial language of our society, in terms of how it both frames class antagonisms and then also seems to try to ameliorate them with right pretty speech about how you are valid and good enough just the way you are as you suffer and get exploited and chained back. That superficial language, to Raimi at heart, is just bullshit, papering over the fact that hierarchies are the most natural thing in the world, that we are all bound together in this cruel fitness regime, and the only real catharsis can come from accepting that suffering and punishment comes regardless, that tables turn, that freak natural events happen that change the guards. But what never changes in this bleak but still vibrantly realized world from Raimi is that people know at an instinctual level that they are not enough and want their efforts to be reflected, not in enough, but in more, and that there is nothing that is of greater utility to a truly cynical subject of late-stage capitalism than the fervent, even monomaniacal fixation on painting ourselves as grandiose victims in order to justify that impulse. To mask and cape more in the language of enough, assimilation into the higher tiers of society, weaved into a myth of individual virtue finally being rewarded by an arc of progress. It's a dark, even kind of politically revolting film, especially given the... Jesus Christ! Whatever, it's still just an incredibly fun ride. I really do hope, though, that maybe it sparks some conversation about more political reading of Raimi's work as a reactionary artist, right up there with the great John Milius. Send Help is practically his Red Dawn, his political thesis statement, and I'm giving it a 4 out of 5. Anyway, I'm getting out of here. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments, what did I get right, what did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm gonna catch you guys next time.